So much, everyone, for coming here for CBT, for introducing me, and for inviting me to come here and speak. What I'd like to talk to you all today is about the implications for Race for Children Act, for Creating Hope Act, and also for Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act and the PIPs in creating strategies for you all to fund your research. And this presentation is directed as much to advocates and funders as physicians and scientists. And here's the lead. The lead is when you're working with a company on a clinical trial, always ask if the trial is a PSP, which means Pediatric Study Plan, or a written request, or could lead to a written request, even if you initiated the contact with the company yourself. So in other words, always ask the company why they're working with you and if there's any regulatory obligation or incentive they have. It has significant implications for your ability to ask for funding. So the first question we have is, why do companies work with pediatric investigators? Now, I wish we could do a vote here, but I'm not sure if we can, but there are three reasons. One is because they care about kids. Two, they are following the science. And three, they have regulatory obligations and incentives. And even those of you who are really well-hearted have to know that it's because they have regulatory obligations and incentives, okay? That is why almost all of the times that companies elect to work with academics, this is why they work with academics. And let me tell you what one friend of mine who said about what it's like for her to, oops, that's you, Angela, hi, to be a pediatric oncologist in the company. She said, well, people at my company give me the sign of the cross when I see pediatrics, okay? So our allies and companies really have an incredibly difficult time advocating for us. Now, so what are the regulatory obligations and incentives? They're Creating Hope Act, Race for Children Act, Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, and then the European Pediatric Investigational Plans. So in this presentation, I'm going to assume that you all have a general background on how pediatric vouchers work, and you have a general background on Race for Children Act and what the implications are. I'll stop for a minute and explain Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act. That's the law that gives companies the opportunity to voluntarily undertake some pediatric studies. And in exchange, if they complete them to FDA's satisfaction, then they receive 6 months of what's called pediatric exclusivity, which is akin to 6 extra months of patent protection. And so that's, of course, a tremendous incentive. If a company is selling for $2 billion on the market, and a company, if a drug product is selling for $2 billion and a company can get 6 additional months of patent protection, that's worth $1 billion. So it's not nothing. And then finally, the European Pediatric Investigation Plans, let's put them aside for a sense because I think the first three really encompass everything. So how do you think about a company's regulatory strategy when it comes to pediatric study plans, okay? So the Race for Children Act requires that, now authorizes the FDA to require that companies draft pediatric study plans. And the pediatric study plans document how the companies will how the companies will study their drugs in pediatrics. So the pediatric study plans, oftentimes the companies hold the IND. I hope when they hold the IND that they're paying for the clinical trial. It isn't 100% of the time, but I hope that they hold the IND and I hope they pay for the trial. The fact that they're doing the trial pursuant to a pediatric study plan will become public record once the FDA accepts that trial, and that's after the academics negotiations with the company are complete. And so it's it's after all the contracts have been signed and after the FDA has reviewed the documentation and accepted the pediatric study plan. The second question that you might want to consider is, well, what's a company's regulatory strategy with respect to written requests? These, of course, are the requests that lead to pediatric exclusivity. So, these studies count for a lot of phase 1 and early phase 2 studies. Oftentimes, if a company is providing, clinical supply of a drug in this case. It's because they're fishing around. They're thinking that if the study provides positive data, that they will have the opportunity to go back to the FDA and ask if they can build a case for a written request leading to pediatric exclusivity. The written request would be a larger and more robust clinical development plan than the more narrow pediatric study plan under RACE. So what do companies do? So companies may provide academics just the drug. They may provide the academics drug plus data collection and monitoring. And they do that because the FDA standards for data collection and monitoring are exceedingly rigorous, something that a lot of academics don't have experience with. And so oftentimes companies want to take control of that piece. And they may even be generous enough to do drug plus data collection and monitoring plus a little extra. And then they probably have right of record in their MTA agreements with you. So when they receive this data later on, they may decide the data is exciting and they want to undertake a full written request. And if they do that, they would be oftentimes holding the IND, but not necessarily, or they just go back and they clean up the data. Now, oopsie. Okay, and as I said, this is the lead again. So for the academics, but also I'm really here talking to everybody who's listening, everyone who funds the academics work, everyone who works with academics. If you have an opportunity, always ask the company if the trial that's being undertaken is a pediatric study plan, which is a PSP, or a written request, or could lead to a written request, even if you initiated the contact with the sponsor. So what happens when you get that result from the company, the response? Well, if the company says no, they have no intention of ever using this data for a written request, and it's not a PSP, then this truly is a case of a company who just, someone in the company who cares about kids gave you the drug, and you're really lucky to get the drug, go home and be thankful. If the trial is a pediatric study plan or written request, the sponsor should hold the IND and they should pay. So I think that, now they're not required to, of course, but I hope that funders and advocates can support academics and identify strategies of working with companies and really press them to pay. Again, the pediatric study plan is a regulatory obligation, and the written request, if they satisfy a complete, to the FDA's satisfaction, could result in literally billions of additional dollars of revenue for the company. And then the third category here, that's the trickiest, is what if the data might be used in the future for a written request? And so, that's the case where a company may just, may not be willing to fund a clinical trial. They may be just waiting for the trial to be completed. And then they may think, well, if it's successful, then maybe we'll wrap that trial into a series of trials that would constitute the written request. And so there again, I hope the funders and the advocates and the academics, all of you who are listening, get together and you have a conversation with the company. Look, if the company is not going to pay for these trials, and if they're going to ask you to assume the risk that the data is positive or negative, then the question is, what upside can you ask for? You, the academics, have never asked for an upside, but could you sell the data? Could you ask for royalties on the pediatric exclusivity? Could you charge the company the cost of the trial plus some overage because you assumed the risk? So I would hope that all of you can start exploring ways, to really capture more of the costs that you're laying out and the value that you're creating. Next steps for legislative advocates such as me and many of you on the phone. Every 5 years, the FDA has an opportunity to reset the user fees they charge industry. And that opportunity occurs in an omnibus bill called the PDUFA bill. The PDUFA bill is set to pass again next summer. It's a must-pass bill, and that would be our opportunity to put together a Race 2.0. And so here are some of the questions that I think we as a community need to think about when we think about what we want in Race 2.0. First of all, as I said, are the companies funding these clinical trials, and why the heck not? And what can we do about that? Secondly, and this really gets back to the core mandate of CBTN, PSPs, these pediatric study plans under RACE, are only effective if we have good molecular data, if there are robust biology studies, if FDA has the authority to require these studies, if companies are funding these studies, so that we really have the scientists have an understanding of what indications to study and how to study them. So how can we support that process better? It's, as I said, CBTN is doing an incredible job off philanthropic funds. What else can we as a country do to support your efforts? And then a third area of general interest to me is the following. RACE created all sorts of opportunities for scientists and clinicians to study new drugs in kids. But as single agents or single agents plus a chemotherapy backbone, we're rarely hoping to get to cures. We're just hoping to get activity, signal of activity, or, if we're lucky, maybe some kids will live a little bit longer, a few more months. To get to cures, we may need combinations of novel therapies. And so how can we support companies so that it's easier, or so that they do this more often? So I'd like to thank you all. Here are two of our kids who are going to Capitol Hill to continue to ask Congress to support pediatric cancer. We're doing an internship program this summer for any of you who have teens or middle schoolers even who would be interested. And I want to thank you all for giving me this opportunity to speak with you today. Thank you. Now I'll turn my, I'll share now back to you, or if someone else can assume the share function, that would be great.
Thank you, Nancy. That was extremely informative and incredibly important to help us energize our community and figure out, how we can really reimagine the way that these things have been done historically to better advantage our efforts. Does anyone have any questions for Nancy that they'd like to pose?
Let me just chime in briefly, Nancy, just in appreciation. Historically, you've been a very poor recipient of compliments, but we really sincerely appreciate this kind of complex work that you and others, like Ellen, coming up next, are doing. It's incredibly time consuming, and we recognize that. So we appreciate that partnership, and looking forward to this next year.
Thank you. I think maybe I whipped through it awfully quickly. In past, I've done these conversations where I gave people the opportunity to jump in as I was going through some of the concepts. And I will just offer, for those of you who are advocates or funders, if you want to have another conversation, so we can think about how to better support academics. We support them by giving them philanthropic funds that we raise, but frankly, if you can help the academics, if you can help them navigate so that they capture a higher share of industry funding, that will be there'll be far more dollars for the academics. So I really ask any of you who have, some kind of business experience or negotiating experience, or just have comfort rolling up your sleeves and working with the academics to understand these strategies, I really urge you to do so. And I'm here to continue talking with you about that.
Brian, I'm not sure if you saw, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. Depending on time, Nancy can either answer them in the Q&A or you can read them or communicate them.
Yeah, I can see them. So I see one from Robert Martin. How important is it to have the Data Commons Dictionary that PCDC will develop to improve the collection of and access to the brain tumor data?
Maybe, I think I answered the one from Sabina.
Up my pay grade.
Yeah.
Sabina. Oh, so open. Okay, so we've got open questions, answered questions, and dismissed questions. Okay. So let me go back. So Sabina asks, how do you think we best fund the infrastructure to support compassionate care requests and associated costs for the clinic?
Such a good question, Sabine. And The answer so far is, I don't really know, and I would love to continue talking with you about that.
Okay. And she adds, especially in the current setting where more and more data collection is being done on behalf of the industry partner.
Mhm.
Robert Martin asks, I have a 14-year-old granddaughter who lost her sister to a brain tumor. How might she be considered to your internship this summer?
Absolutely. Go to my website, and it's JENN@kidsbecancer.org, or we have instructions on our website. We'd love to have her.